Michael.
Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Pretty good. Let me just introduce the two of us for the Blogging Heads audience. I'm John Horgan. I'm a regular correspondent on scientific matters for Blogging Heads TV. And today I'm very pleased to be talking with the environmental activist Michael Shellenberger. So, Michael, could you just briefly introduce yourself to the Blogging Heads audience?
Sure. My name is Michael Shellenberger, and I'm the co-author of a new book called Breakthrough, From the Death of Environmentalism to the Politics of Possibility. And I'm also the president of a think tank called the Breakthrough Institute.
Yeah, and you're also with something called American Environics?
Yeah, American Environics is our consulting firm. We do sort of next-generation political and public opinion research for political campaigns and issue campaigns. And
your background is in progressive politics and environmental activism generally?
Yeah, both Ted, my co-author, and I come out of the environmental movement, the broader progressive political movement. Been working in it ever since we graduated from college.
Which was when? You're young, right? You're just in your mid-30s?
I am. I'm 36. I graduated from college in 1993.
Okay, so I first heard about you guys when I read about your essay, The Death of Environmentalism, in 2003, right?
We wrote the essay in the fall of 2004, just before the presidential elections.
Okay. And so the Times had some coverage, and then I happen to live in Garrison, New York, on the Hudson River, which is a hotbed of environmentalism. So right down the street from me is Andy Revkin, who writes about the environment for the New York Times. I'm also friends with a guy named John Cronin, who was one of the original River Keepers, which is a very important local environmental group. Sure. John Adams, the founder of the National Resources Defense Council, used to live right down the street from us. He just moved away within the last year or so.
Right.
And so at cocktail parties and just sort of around town, I would hear people talking about your essay. And then I never actually read it, although I read the coverage. And then last fall, I was talking to Andy Revkin and telling him that I have this Green Book Award that I created at my school. So I run this thing called the Center for Science Writings, and we decided to give an award every year to a book that had a really important environmental message. So last year we gave it to Edward Wilson for his book, The Creation, and I was looking for a worthy follow-up to that, and I was asking Andy Revkin for ideas, and he suggested your book. He suggested several books, but your book was at the top of the list. And so I read it. This guy I work with, Suhas Sridhar, he read it. We were both very impressed, provoked. It's a book that it got my brain really sparking. So we decided to give you guys the award, and we're actually going to be giving you and your co-author, Ted Nordhaus, that award at Stevens. And I hope the Blogging Heads people take note in case they live in our area. We're giving it to you next Wednesday, April 30th, at Stevens Institute. And I'll post a link that provides more information on that event in case anybody wants to come.
Well, thanks very much for that. We're really honored to receive it, John.
Yeah, so it really is an honor to have you here.
Well,
so tell us what is the theme of, let's just stick with Breakthrough instead of your original essay.
Yeah.
What are the main arguments in the book?
Well, I mean, I think you can look at Breakthrough as having two big arguments that are interrelated, but which can be sort of dealt with separately. The first argument is a very contemporary one. It argues that the older pollution problems we dealt with in the past are fundamentally different, are qualitatively different from global warming. So attaching catalytic converters to the tailpipes of cars to deal with smog, or affixing scrubbers to smokestacks to deal with acid rain. These were relatively inexpensive technical fixes that worked pretty well for past pollution problems. We called the older politics a politics of limits because it was focused on sort of minimizing human intrusions upon nature, regulatory limits, basically constraining human activities and human power. And what we argue with global warming is that it's a qualitatively different challenge. It doesn't require, so much pollution limits as economic development of a different order, of a different kind. It requires massive technological innovation. And the reason for that is because global warming requires that we move away from fossil fuels entirely by the end of this century, and that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least half worldwide by 2050 during the same period of time that global energy consumption will at least double. In the developing world, it will triple or quadruple even before the middle of the century. So we have a big challenge, which is really creating a new energy economy. And that requires not so much a politics of limits as a politics of possibility, a politics that's oriented around major investments in technology innovation, oriented around creating a kind of economic development in places like China and India and the rest of the developing world that both sort of meets their basic material needs while also moving them to a cleaner energy economy. So that's sort of the first kind of big argument in the book. The second argument, which is related to the first, is that there is a pattern and a trajectory to human development, to economic development, and that the environmental movement was born in the United States when it was born in the 1960s, not because we were suddenly faced with new industrial pollution problems. That's sort of the traditional story that gets told. That we saw the Earth from outer space, that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, and pollution just got so bad that the American people sort of finally rose up against it.
Right, Silent Spring was published, and we all felt that we were poisoning nature and so forth.
Exactly. And we point out that the Cuyahoga River had been catching on fire since the 19th century. It had been catching on fire since the 1860s. And it wasn't like nobody noticed that the Cuyahoga River was a disaster ecologically. It was that the people of Cleveland had much bigger issues to deal with. They had a big cholera epidemic, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century. So certain things came first, creating a sanitation system, creating a sewage system, water treatment facilities. And that by the 1960s, Americans were so wealthy that we started to turn to what sociologists sometimes call quality of life issues. The quality of the air, the quality of the water, the desire to be out in wilderness areas. And that's a great thing, that's a part of human development, and that we can't but the consequence is that we can't expect Chinese peasants or Brazilians living in slums or Indians to care more about global warming than they care about their much more basic material needs. And so the argument of the book is that we have to understand that there's this pattern to human development, and that the development that we're going to have in the 21st century is going to be sustainable to the extent to which we invest in new energy systems and cleaner technologies, and that this won't happen by the private sector by itself, that private firms can't do this without a concerted push by the government. And so there's both sort of what people see as both kind of a progressive argument to the book, but they also see that there's a bit of pragmatism here too, which says that we're not going to expect China and India and Brazil to be persuaded by our arguments about global warming when they have much more pressing issues that they face every day.
Now, these arguments also sort of came in the context of your growing dissatisfaction with the way that the mainstream environmental groups were dealing with global warming and some other environmental problems, I take it. So can you explain how you sort of came to be dissatisfied in that way?
Sure. Both Ted and I basically worked for every major environmental group in the country, all the big foundations. I've worked for grassroots environmental groups, including Earth First. So we go way back.
Earth First, really?
Yeah.
Well, Earth First, because Earth First is, it's fair to say that's a pretty radical, even Luddite group, isn't it?
Yeah. It sure is. Although, it's not really a group, so it's...
Right, it's sort of distributed cells.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they're responsible for sort of acts of eco-vandalism.
Well, the group that I worked with was in Northern California, and they were totally nonviolent.
Yeah.
But suffice it to say, we've changed a lot since we were working for Earth First, and obviously we've changed a lot since we were working for the Sierra Club.
Right.
So yeah, we came out of, we were really focused on global warming in the late 90s, Ted and I were, and we were sort of getting together to figure out why is it that we've made so little progress on this issue. I mean, for most Americans, the issue hit the national scene around the late 80s when James Hansen, the NASA scientist, testified in front of Congress. And there's been about 20 years of inaction in the United States, and frankly, inaction globally. So the death of environmentalism came out of our frustration with the unwillingness on the part of our colleagues to really rethink their approach and to rethink their political strategy in the face of really repeated failure. So that was sort of the essay, and in the essay we asked a set of questions that we weren't really prepared to answer. So we asked a question like, what is it that we really worry about when it comes to global warming? If we're worried about, hurricanes and extreme weather events and droughts, well, shouldn't we be worried about those extreme weather events are happening right now? And we're actually asking the same question on our blog right now, which is to say, there's big food shortages and food riots happening all around the world right now. And so why is it that we as environmentalists would only care about food shortages and starvation happening in the future because of global warming? Why wouldn't we be involved in a politics to address those food shortages right now?
Right, and of course some of these food shortages, according to what I've been reading in the New York Times, are being blamed, at least in part, to a shift to biofuels away from food crops.
Absolutely. And the lesson that we take from that is that global warming should really be understood as a consequence of a much larger energy crisis. I mean, if you want to call it a crisis, if you want to call it energy shortages and energy transition, I mean, we're moving, I don't think there's any doubt that we're running out of oil. I don't think that civilization is going to collapse as a consequence of it. But we are really faced with the question of whether we're going to just maintain the sort of dependence that we've had on fossil fuels, or whether we're going to really set off in a new direction with new technologies. Technologies that, by the way, might include, capturing the carbon dioxide from, coal and natural gas plants and storing it underground. But the bigger point is that it was sort of an effort to kind of say, what is it that we're concerned about protecting? Is it really human life? And if so, why are we only concerned about human life to the extent to which it's threatened by global warming? If it's the natural world, if it's the non-human world, then what are we doing to advance a strategy that allows the human beings who live around the places we want to save, like the Amazon, what are we doing to help them to pursue a different kind of economic development that doesn't require destroying their natural resources?
Yeah. Now, I want to situate you in the within some of the other criticisms of the environmental movement that have been made over the years. One person that I thought of while reading your book is Julian Simon, who had this famous argument with Paul Ehrlich that I think went back to the 1970s about, it was sort of about what about this dichotomy that you guys bring up, limitation versus innovation. So Simon was very pro-growth. He believed in human creativity, and that science, technological progress would solve overpopulation and a lot of the other problems that go along with it. Whereas Ehrlich was saying that sort of the sky is falling, and we have to restrain population and do all these other things to limit human growth. Otherwise, we're going to face a catastrophe. So, do you see your own thinking as being similar to Simon's in any way?
There are parts of his view that we definitely share. I think it's also worth pointing out that he won that bet with Paul Ehrlich.
Yes, right.
It was actually a bet around the price of key minerals.
Right, which can apply to a lot of other presumably limited resources. So Simon was saying that human ingenuity will come up with new ways of extracting these resources more cheaply, and so you're not going to get these inevitable price increases.
Right.
Although we are here in a period of $3.50 gasoline.
Right. I think Ted and I share with Simon is the view that we're not going to run out of stuff. We're not going to run out of resources. That we might run out of oil, for example, but we'll invent other fuels, or we'll hopefully, I hope that we'll move to an electrified transportation system where we have battery-powered vehicles that are charged from cleaner forms of electricity. I think where we part ways with Julian Simon, and I think Bjorn Lomborg actually has more in common with Julian Simon than we do, and I think where we part ways with Lomborg is the view that we don't really need governments to do anything, that this can all be taken care of by the private sector. Well, I think that the private sector can take care of a lot of this, but I don't think that the private sector is going to be able to deal with climate change. And the reason is that there's a set of what economists call market failures on the way to creating this new technological future. And so one way to think about it, and the example we point to in the book, is we say, look, we couldn't have fought the Soviet Union with just private firms. It really required a concerted push by the federal government. We couldn't have fought World War II without the United States government being involved in some way. And while those are imperfect analogies, we think there's something really important that we're not going to be able to get from our current sort of heavy fossil fuel intensive economy to a clean energy economy without significant federal investments in new technologies that are currently more expensive than fossil fuels. I mean, that's the big point. And where we part ways with environmentalists is that they imagine that they're going to be able to, through pollution regulations, raise the price of fossil fuels high enough to make clean energy technologies competitive. We don't think that they're going to be able to do that for political reasons. In other words, we don't think that the publics of the United States, much less China and India, are going to want to see their electricity prices go up so high as to make solar panels, for example, cost competitive.
Yeah. Let me just, going back to Simon again, I thought that Simon had said you get these benefits from growing populations. Mainly, you just get more brains that can solve problems. What's your position about population growth and whether or not we would need any kind of top-down restraints on it, sort of in the style of China? I don't recall you guys in your book really addressing the overpopulation head-on.
We did. There's a passage in the book where we criticize Al Gore for pointing the finger at in terms of overpopulation at, say, the Brazilians, where we kind of say, well, the Brazilians are logging their rainforest for economic development purposes. It's not because they're running out of space. Brazil's actually a massive country with a population that's much smaller than the United States' population. So it's not quite. It's not a very good analysis. I think both Ted and I are very skeptical of the concerns about overpopulation. We tend to find them expressed by wealthy individuals in the developed world rather than poor people in the developing world. We think that population generally declines, or rather I should say fertility rates decline with increasing prosperity, with increasing access to education, and with the empowerment of women. And so we tend to think that population is going to take care of itself over time as people become more prosperous. And that's part of that argument that we make about sort of a logic of human development. At the same time, I have to say, you look at a place like China, and it's hard not to think that there wasn't real intelligence in the one-child policy that they've had. And I think that they made that for national security reasons. They just weren't able to it really came out of a period of starvation in China where they just weren't able to take care of all their people. So I think in certain contexts it might be okay, but of course I think it's worth pointing out that China's a dictatorship, and if they had a democracy, I'm not sure that the people would vote to renew that. So I think the hope with places like China is that they will become prosperous they'll become so prosperous that eventually they'll become increasingly democratic with increasing individual freedoms, and that the point in which they become a kind of voting democracy, there won't be as strong of a desire to have big families anyway. It's part of the move from a farm-based society to an urban one.
I just want to go back to the issue of private versus federal investment in alternative energy. And I think it was in an article in Wired about you guys. You'd said that you thought Silicon Valley would embrace your call for a really massive investment in energies, and yet there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for it. You thought this was ironic since it was federal investment in computer technologies, integrated circuits, and then, of course, the Internet that led to the explosion of computer and communications technologies over the last 20 years. So I wonder if you could just address that issue, since you guys are right out there next to Silicon Valley.
Right. Well, it's a very widespread myth that Silicon Valley was sort of invented in Bill Hewlett's garage. Hewlett-Packard is sort of these, great lone inventors. And while obviously the human inventive spirit is critical to that enterprise, Hewlett-Packard wouldn't exist if it hadn't gotten very large contracts from the military to make radios. And then later in the 1950s, the federal government, in its space race with the Soviet Union, it needed computers, so it literally bought down the price of microchips from about $1,000 a chip in the late 50s to just $20 a chip less than 10 years later. And now microchips obviously are everywhere and have been a huge part of economic growth and rising levels of productivity. The Internet, as you mentioned, it was literally invented in a government laboratory. And Al Gore, I think actually Al Gore deserves a Nobel Prize, not so much for his work on global warming, but for his work commercializing the Internet. He literally brought the Internet out of the defense, narrowly military focus, to the public. And so it's this kind of innovation that, that government-supported innovation that has allowed Silicon Valley to thrive. I mean, even Google got military contracts early in its history. And so to sort of imagine that solar and wind and the companies that are building machines to capture carbon and store it underground, to imagine that these companies are going to be able to compete on their own without significant government investment is just a fantasy. And what we discovered in the research for our book is that we couldn't really find energy economists who said that there wasn't any need for government investment. It was environmentalists who, in the national environmental movement, which really I think politically, in a political calculation, has decided that it wants to focus narrowly on regulation because it imagines that regulation is more popular than major government investment. And that's where we just disagree. We point to a lot of evidence in our book that shows that the vision of major investments to make clean energy cheap rather than regulations to make dirty energy expensive are much more popular. And I think we need both, but I think that the political emphasis should be on the investments in technology.
So all the presidential candidates seem to be talking about green jobs, green technologies, and so forth. Which, if any, strikes you as genuinely committed to this sort of investment?
Well, both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton have called for $150 billion over 10 years to be invested in new technologies. And we lobbied both camps very hard to go for $300 billion. They both went about halfway. John McCain has sent mixed signals. On the one hand, he said he just wants pollution regulations, but his advisor has also said that he recognizes the need for federal investments in innovation. I think obviously anybody over George W. Bush is an improvement, but I think we really need to have a candidate who puts big investments at the center of his or her climate proposal. And for that, I think that we see a better plan from both Obama and Clinton.
Do you think that's a political winner at this point?
Oh, I think it's
Are you surprised that none of them has made a bigger commitment to this sort of investment program?
I am surprised. It's a huge source of frustration for us. I mean, here Hillary and Obama were like competing for working class, blue collar Democrats in Pennsylvania, we literally created a proposal for a new Apollo project in clean energy, doing focus groups and polling among Pennsylvania voters, and we found that it was hugely popular. It was something like 84% of Pennsylvania voters.
John Horgan. Please leave a message at the tone. This number also receives...
I'm trying to figure out how to...
Hi, John.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's a true Blogging Heads moment.
Okay.
So, are you surprised that none of the candidates has called for a bigger investment because they see this, if you want to be cynical about it, just as a politically astute move?
Yeah, we've been very surprised that the candidates haven't talked more about it. Now, they, when both the Democratic candidates, Clinton and Obama, get asked about what they would do for the economy, both of them often say they want to create green jobs. And in Pennsylvania, they both did talk about the need to invest $150 billion at least over 10 years to create these jobs. But yeah, we were surprised that they didn't make a bigger deal out of it and a bit frustrated. We actually created this proposal for a new Apollo project back in 2003 and 2004 by doing focus groups and polling in Pennsylvania. And we found that the idea of investing in clean energy jobs was hugely popular. In fact, it was more popular among working class Democrats than it was among liberal Democrats. It was actually in other words, it was more popular, in fact, among swing voters than it was among Democratic primary voters. And so, I think the hope is that whichever Democrat wins the nomination, that there's going to be a much more emphasis on this in leading up to the November elections, because our research shows that it's one of the most exciting proposals that people have. I think if you were to ask your average Pennsylvanian, your average Pennsylvania voter what they really care about, I think they'd tell you health care and then jobs. And when you start talking about jobs that can save the world, that inspires everybody. And I think that that's the way that a new politics ought to be created around that, rather than around, what sort of pollution limits do we need to avoid global warming apocalypse?
I should mention that I work at an engineering school. Stevens Institute is about 70% of the students there are engineering majors. Just this spring, for the first time, the school offered a green minor in engineering, and there is a tremendous hunger for the students, many of whom I've spoken to about this, to they want to become engineers because it's intellectually challenging, and they think they can make a pretty good living. But the idea of doing that plus doing something that has a greater social good, or even good for all of nature, is extremely appealing to them.
Right.
And I would assume that it would, appeal to a lot of people.
It is. It's an incredibly appealing vision, and this is the frustration that really led us to write The Death of Environmentalism and then to write Breakthrough. The frustration with the major environmental groups in Washington who have pursued a politics that's centrally focused on saying, hey, global warming is a major threat to civilization. We can solve it like we solved acid rain. Well, it's just not the case. We can't solve global warming like we solved acid rain. New pollution limits are part of it, but it's really going to require something much more like what we had with the New Deal, with World War II, with the Cold War, with the big investments in the computer sciences. We forget, but the federal government created the computer sciences field in education. And one of the things that when we talk to energy scientists and engineers, they tell us, they say, we're not creating the new energy scientists and engineers we need to be creating. So you start to get, with this focus on creating a new clean energy economy, you start to get into a much broader set of concerns, including around education, including around national security, around jobs, around rebuilding communities, around infrastructure. It's a much more expansive politics. It's a much more exciting politics. It's actually much easier to understand than when you start with a fairly complicated story of climate change and then a fairly complicated story of cap and trade and emissions trading and offsets. all of which has been, frankly, a bureaucratic mess globally for the last 10 years. So it's a bit of, what's motivated, the mood that motivated the book and the essay was a bit one of frustration and just enough of the 1960s politics. It's time for a 21st century politics.
What another set of critics of conventional environmentalism that you guys reminded me of are they're sometimes called brown lash. I think that might have been a term that Paul Ehrlich actually coined to disparage these people. So the one that comes to mind is Greg Easterbrook, who wrote a book in the mid-'90s criticizing environmentalists for being too gloomy and focusing on doomsday. And
right.
Easterbrook said that this led to fatalism that would actually be counterproductive. I think
yes.
Charles Mann, very good science journalist, wrote a book that had a similar critique of environmentalism. Are you aware of those people,
sure.
and how do you situate yourself to relative
Absolutely.
to them?
Yeah. Well, I think there's some things that we agree with and some things that we disagree with. I mean, I think we fundamentally agree with Easterbrook that we need a politics that is more grounded in optimism than pessimism. We think the track record for the human race is actually pretty good one. Obviously, there's 7 billion of us, and there's been collapses in the past, but we've obviously mostly overcome those past crises, and there's no reason to think we're not going to overcome this one as well. There's obviously some huge challenges, but we're also way more technologically sophisticated. We're much wealthier than we've ever been. I think where we disagree a bit with Easterbrook, at least, is that we often see him embracing very similar regulatory focus as the environmental groups, and so a big focus on cap and trade on his part, and we just don't think it's going to have much impact. And so there's really, I think, where we might agree, and this is the same problem we have with Schwarzenegger, our governor. He's actually got a great discourse around human ingenuity, around human empowerment, around creating a new economy. But his policy framework is basically identical to the one that's being pushed by Environmental Defense and NRDC. And while we support those pollution regulations, we just don't think it's going to get us anywhere near, it's not even going to get us on the path of dealing with this challenge. And that's why so much of the breakthrough is focused on really like understanding how do paradigms work and how do paradigms change. We think we've been stuck in kind of a pollution paradigm for about 40 years, and it's time to move on to a paradigm much more focused on modernization and technology innovation.
So, Matthew Iglesias, he's one of the contributors to Blogging Heads, and he wrote the review of your book in the New York Times. And I thought the most important point that he made was that you guys create this dichotomy between limit-oriented fixes to global warming, like cap and trade, and, of course, innovation, new alternative clean technologies. And he says that these aren't mutually exclusive, that you can generate funds from emission taxes and things like this that can be applied to research on improved technologies.
Yeah.
So I wonder just how you guys address that point.
Right. Well, we agree that cap and trade, that's what we call that's what the pollution regulation framework for global warming is called. Cap and trade has the possibility of raising the $30 to $50 billion a year that we need to invest in technology innovation. The problem is that already you're starting to see the coalition that's come together on cap and trade to fall apart. So from the left, there's attacks on the legislation is called Lieberman-Warner after its sponsors. There's attacks on Lieberman-Warner that it's too weak from the left of the environmental movement. There's attacks on it from the energy companies such as Duke Energy, which was one of the early champions of a cap and trade solution, saying that it would raise energy prices too high because it would auction the pollution allowances. And so we're very concerned that the compromise deal that will get cut will be a cap-and-trade legislation that doesn't raise any money for technology. And we think that would be catastrophic from a policy and a political perspective. So the problem comes when you misunderstand what is necessary in terms of a policy framework. And for the most part, most of the people that the people that criticized our book on this point, they don't really understand the energy sector. They don't really understand the reasons why we're not going to be able to sort of regulate and limit our way to a new energy economy. Whereas when you really look at, we did a pretty extensive review of the energy sciences literature. Andy Revkin interviewed, I think, over 4 dozen energy experts, and all of them say that you have to have major government investments to dramatically bring down the price and scale up clean energy technologies. I think pollution regulations have a place, but they really need to be understood as really a smaller part of the solution, not the main play here.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you about some of the philosophical issues that you raised in your book, which were quite profound. It's one of the things that made your book interesting is that you get into these kind of wonky discussions of the various benefits of regulatory schemes versus innovation and where you should put your investments. But then you've got a section, for example, where you bring up Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, and you've already mentioned in our talk today the need for new paradigms. You also have a section where you criticize environmentalists for sort of enshrining science, science with a capital S, which leads to scientism, sort of almost a worship of science. And you call for a very different attitude. Obviously, you're pro-science. You see science as generating the solutions to global warming and some of our other environmental problems. But you also call for sort of dragging science down from its pedestal to an extent. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. Well, the argument we make, and this is the criticism of scientism is an old one, and we borrow from some very good thinkers about it. And the argument is just that the sciences, since there's obviously more than one, and they function very differently, as you know from your work studying the sciences. The sciences are really important. I mean, obviously they're central to creating the kind of civilization we live in. They have revealed all sorts of new mysteries about the universe and about Earth. But we need to have some humility about it too. I mean, the sciences, every time you make a discovery, you create a new mystery, so to speak. We need to have a little bit of humility about it, that we are still, mortal beings with, limited senses, and we get a lot of stuff wrong, and that science is in a constant state of change. And that at a political perspective, the critique that we make is that there's other ways to motivate collective action on global warming or on anything than through appeals to the sciences. In fact, there's many better ways to motivate public action than through appeal to the sciences. So the sciences are important. It should guide the kind of policies we construct. It should guide our analysis. But politics, and if you look at the campaigns being run, especially Barack Obama, politics is about aspiring for a better world. It involves mythologies and symbolism and a much frankly more ancient set of values and concerns than the sciences do. And so I think that those of us who care about dealing with global warming need to draw on, other sort of histories, other stories about the world, and we need to understand that there's not a single story that we can tell, that the sciences don't tell us a single story. They tell us many different stories about the human history, about human development, and that we would do well to sort of tap into those often unconscious and even irrational parts of human being in order to motivate this quite massive transition to a new economy and really to a new world.
Do you worry that, I would think that one of the objections of, for example, somebody like James Hansen to what you just said about science, and this is a very postmodern view, is that it could be used to undermine or to challenge some of the evidence for global warming, for example, and linking global warming to fossil fuel emissions. Has that criticism been raised? Is that something that you worry about when you talk about science?
Well, I mean, the irony, of course, is that global warming activists and scientists have been duking it out over the last 20 years about the existence of global warming, not with postmodernists, but with people claiming the mantle of science. And so, and you look at James Hansen, he's done excellent work, obviously, in the climate sciences. His political advocacy, though, doesn't necessarily flow out of the sciences. In other words, he's advocating that we stop building all new coal-fired power plants all over the world. Well, maybe that's a good strategy, maybe it's not, but James Hansen isn't any more qualified to say what a good political strategy is than I am, someone who is obviously an amateur when it comes to climate science. But frankly, we think that that scientists should have no more political standing in these debates than anybody else, and that really politics, there's no, that we all draw on the sciences, whether it's public opinion research or climate science or energy sciences, to guide our work, and then we need to hash it out and have that debate rather than assuming that because James Hansen did very good work on climate change, that he is going to be an effective political advocate. I just don't think that, and honestly, I don't think that the track record of climate scientists advocating for the kind of changes we need politically has been particularly impressive. So I think that's really the argument. I don't think you really need any recourse to postmodernism to suggest that scientists shouldn't have any special political standing.
It seemed sort of philosophically related to the point you were just making about science. You also have in your book this critique of the way nature is enshrined by environmentalists. Also comes capitalized, nature with a capital N, and that the traditional rhetoric of environmentalism creates this dichotomy between humans on the one hand and nature on the other.
Right.
And humans are this kind of disruption of nature, and we pollute it, we taint it somehow, and conservation and environmentalism are seen as sort of repurifying nature. I wonder if you can address that issue as well.
Well, we point out that really environmentalism often imagines that it has broken from Western philosophy, and we argue that it really hasn't. So, of course, in traditional Western philosophy, humans are the subjects. The nature is the object of our study. In other words, we are in control. We have free will, and we are understanding the world using science in an objective way. And the environmental story says, and of course the assumption there in that older philosophical story is that humans are separate from nature. In other words, it's not that nature is working upon us or motivating us or driving how we pay attention to things and controlling us through our instincts and our emotions and our whole selves being really, we don't think of ourselves as objects of nature, we think of ourselves as subjects over it. And so what environmentalism does is sort of reverses it, and it says, yes, humans are separate from nature, but nature is superior to humans, and humans get punished by nature when they sin against it. That's what the whole narrative, I mean, people don't realize it, but if you read Silent Spring, she opens that book by telling a story about really a fall from a bucolic farm life, and it's a fall from Eden narrative. It's a very old, tragic fall from nature story. And in fact, much of that book, she uses science to make an argument against DDT and other pesticides. But she also implies that the sciences are really, that really it's out, that they need to be subjugated to nature. And we just point out in the book sort of the obvious point that humans never stopped being part of nature. We obviously evolved from the earth. We're just as much a part of the earth as anything else. And so the question is really not, how to protect nature, how to be one with nature, but it's really what kind of natures do we want to create? I mean, the big philosophical point we draw on people like Nietzsche and the existentialists to deal with it is that we are fully in control now. Humans are in control of the earth, and we may not like it or not, but we have domesticated all of the world, including the Amazon, is in the process of, the great, gigantic Amazon is in the process of being domesticated, and that we have to deal with it. And the question is, it's in the last line of the book, we actually borrow a quote from Stuart Brand, who was one of the founders of the modern environmental movement, and he just says, we have become as gods, and we might as well get good at it. And that's sort of the call of the book, is let's have a little self-awareness of who we are, of our instincts, of our emotions, of how the stories we tell, how they affect the world. Let's have some humility about it, and let's also embrace our power to create a kind of planet that we want to live on.
Yeah, even though you're talking about that in pretty philosophical terms, there has actually been a lot of research both in human evolution and the evolution of life in general, which really drastically undermines first the notion that there is this thing, this sort of static thing called nature, which without humans would be in this wonderful equilibrium. Nature from the beginning has been very dynamic in a state of constant change, sort of growth and collapse. There have been all these great extinction events that have shaped the history of life on Earth. And then when it comes to humans in nature, there was this sort of Rousseauian idea of humans before civilization living in harmony with each other and with nature.
Right.
And that has really been pretty much shattered over the last 20 or 30 years.
Right.
In fact, I think that was something that Charles Mann, the journalist I mentioned before, wrote about.
Yeah.
There's a guy at Harvard named Stephen LeBlanc who's also written about how in North America, for example, you had this picture of the Indians living in harmony with nature in movies like Dances with Wolves.
Right.
And that is just a complete myth.
Right.
That the Indians were actually in a very unstable relationship with nature and slaughtered massive quantities of animals and wiped out many species.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. I think we point this out that we draw. I think on Charles Mann wrote the book 1496. Is that right? Or he wrote the book about. Anyway, we drew, I think, on some of his research about how violent a lot of these indigenous groups were. And, of course, they didn't have a concept of nature. They were just simply trying to survive and thrive in a hostile environment. And, we got to let go. I think the environmental movement in that way, there's like half of it that I think has let go of a lot of that sort of nostalgia, that sort of Rousseauian nostalgia. But half of it is really stuck there, and I think that there is a relationship between having that kind of nostalgic view, and you still see it. Even around Earth Day, you still find these people that are sort of like, well, the only way we're going to solve the global ecological crises is if we all sort of grow our own foods and produce our own energy, and it's just not a reality. It's just not. That's just nostalgia masquerading as a political strategy. And it becomes dangerous when the message is that, well, we don't need any government intervention in the economy. We can just do this, on our own and sort of self-sufficient, small communities. And it's just a very fantasy. And I think the dark side of it is, at the worst, it gets kind of apocalyptic, which is the peak oil movement. This idea that everything's going to kind of come tumbling down, that global warming and the end of oil is going to result in a society that essentially halts and we go back to our barbarian states. I also think that the other just negative part is it just turns people off to political engagement. It just turns people off to wanting to shape a better world. And so that's why I think it's just time to let that stuff go. And I'm pretty optimistic from talking to young people that those older forms of nostalgia are on their way out.
You mentioned some work by, I think they're psychologists, that involves a theory called mortality salience.
Yeah.
I've heard it called terror management theory, which bears on the type of rhetoric that you get to motivate people. I wonder if you can just talk about the relevance of that to your views on environmentalism.
Sure. Well, there's actually a whole community of very good young scholars. Most of them are psychologists or sociologists who have been doing research into how emotions like fear of death, how they affect our political attitudes. And some of this comes out of World War II. You remember Stanley Milgram was a 28-year-old, I think, Yale professor, did experiments on how, trying to understand how did the Nazis win so much compliance. And he would use sort of techniques to trigger authoritarianism among his subjects, profoundly disturbing set of experiments. That work has continued. What these scientists now tell us is that when they do these experiments where they get people to think about their own deaths, when they become fearful of the world. Even on global warming, the philanthropist Ted Turner did a set of focus groups in the year 2000 where they would show very frightening disaster scenarios around global warming. And then they would ask people, what do you think we should do about it? And the reaction people had was one of survivalism. It was, boy, I think I'm going to need a bigger SUV to survive the coming hurricanes. Or,
Great.
Or on the case of fear, what you find is that when people get very scared, they become, I think two things happen. The first is they become resistant to change, not open to change. And obviously we argue that we need to make a lot of changes if we're going to deal with global warming. So scaring people about it is a bad idea. And people also become, they justify inequality. They they become more prejudiced racially and on gender issues and sexually. And so we're arguing that really, if you keep people in a state of fear, they're going to embrace a very reactionary conservative politics, which is the opposite of what we think is needed. But if you can take people from a state of fear to a place of hope, of optimism, of kind of can-do spirit, then people feel very empowered and they're willing to actually make the big investments in the future that we all need to make. And so that's the argument, is that it's not like we can banish fear from our lives or from our politics, but we need a politics that's really focused on overcoming that fear rather than wallowing in it.
I just have to mention something that made me uneasy as I read your book, for personal reasons. So I live in this beautiful hamlet on the Hudson River. Garrison is part of a township called Phillipstown, and includes this beautiful little village, Cold Spring, just north of us. As I said, there are all these environmentalists here. There are several parks, monasteries. There's a lot of land that can't be developed, but then there's a bunch of land that can be. And we're only 50 miles from New York City. We're right next to Westchester, all these heavily developed areas. Developers are just lurking all around this place, salivating over it, trying to figure out how they can exploit it, make money off it, and we are in a constant fight to keep them out.
Right.
And while I was reading your section on NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and on sort of the irrationality of trying to preserve nature as it is. I mean, this whole area was all farmland. I'm looking out right now at all this forest outside of my office. This was all farmland. This isn't primeval nature, but it's beautiful now. Right. And we want to keep it this way.
Sure.
And so, as I said, when I'm reading some of your critiques of the goals of conservationists and of the problem of NIMBYism, I thought, geez, some of these developers could grab your book and use it to make those of us who are fighting to keep Garrison the way it is feel bad.
Sure. Yeah, I think, just to, what the argument that we make is that we need to have a politics that is pro-development, but the development should be the kind of development that we want. So I like a lot of parkland. I also, we started out saving redwood forest. Ted and I started out saving redwood forest together. We still spend a lot of time in some of the really wild and undeveloped part of California. But I think it's important to recognize that when we decide not to develop a piece of forest land or to protect some farmlands, we're actually making a choice about the kind of nature, the kind of development that we want. And so what the argument that we make is, and it is a little bit subtle, is that we can't justify what we want according to what nature wants. That nature isn't telling us what to do, and that really these are different choices about how we want the human environment to be. And that our politics are going to be more honest and more effective, we think, when we put forward a vision that explicitly recognizes that this is about what we want. This is about our needs, not about what nature wants. Because, you can justify, the argument that we point out in the book is that, NIMBYism can cut both ways. I mean, you can, organize locally to oppose a coal-fired power plant, but you can also organize locally to oppose a wind farm, which is what the Kennedys and a bunch of other very affluent environmentalists in Cape Cod are doing. I should note, against what most people in Cape Cod want, which is the wind farm. So the point that we make, and this is actually just to bring it home a little bit. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the northernmost county of California, which is just beautiful. It's forest land that hasn't yet been turned into subdivisions, and I'm part of an effort to keep that area protected as forest land rather than as subdivisions. But the arguments that we're making is that this is really the kind of development that we want for Humboldt County. That Humboldt County has an opportunity to be a place where the cities become more dense, where there's more people living in the city, and there's all sorts of wonderful advantages in terms of the quality of life to being able to walk to the local farmer's market or walk to the local mass transit, to be able to have a lot of convenience associated with where you want to live. And then when you want to get out into quote-unquote nature, when you want to get out into the wilderness, you can go do that too, because we've protected it from just turning into another subdivision. So it's really about a kind of political posture, more about a political posture and about a political orientation than it is about a particular policy agenda that we should or shouldn't pursue.
Let me ask you another question that is personally motivated. I don't think anywhere in your book you address nuclear power. Mm-hmm. And of course that's become a hot button issue, very divisive within the environmental movement.
Right.
You mentioned Stuart Brand earlier. Stuart Brand has become an advocate for nuclear power now as a way of reducing dependence on fossil fuels. What do you guys think about nukes? And I say this,
right.
I said it was personal. We are just north of the Indian Point nuclear power plant. It's just 4 miles south of us on the Hudson River,
right.
which has become extremely controversial in this area.
Sure. Well, we did mention it very briefly. We didn't want to spend a lot of time on nuclear or other technologies because we felt like there were bigger issues to deal with than the particular kinds of technologies that we pursue per se. But since then, I'll just say that we've done a pretty extensive review of the energy literature, and what's striking about it is that while climate scientists and energy scientists are much more alarmed than the public is about global warming, they're actually much less worried about nuclear power and the risks that it poses than the average American. And so while I don't think nuclear power is an ideal power, I think it's, we get about 18% of our electricity from it. France gets about 80% of its from nuclear power. There's obviously been accidents and all sorts of safety problems, but the reality is when you look at energy, there's deaths and injuries associated with all kinds of energy sources. And so it's really a question of risk. I think the one point I would just make about nuclear is that I think it's part of our energy mix. I think it's going to continue to be part of it. But I don't think it's the Band-Aid solution, just because I don't think that we can build enough nuclear power plants to meet all of our electricity needs. I think it's going to be a much more diverse mix of technologies than that. And I also just think that, those of us that grew up in the anti-nuclear movement, as I did and as Ted did, I think it's worth really taking a second look at the source, at the energy source. I think that the technologies have improved over the last 30 years. I think that the safety precautions have improved. I think there's going to be new challenges associated with, not just the waste, but also the safety concerns around nuclear proliferation. But I obviously don't think that it's a technology that we should dismiss out of hand, because I do think it has an important role to play in dealing with climate change.
I just have to ask you about Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's movie.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that there are some people who are... so you take some shots at Gore, and some people take some shots at you for doing that. So I wonder if you can just tell us what your problem is with Inconvenient Truth.
Sure. Well, and I should say, too, that the funny thing is that the shots that people take at us for having criticized Al Gore are not really arguments. It's just sort of like, how dare you criticize Al Gore? And
right.
And I find that a little bit disturbing, because while I think Al Gore has done some very important things, I don't think that anybody should be immune to criticism. And I worry a little bit about some of the attitude of, like, how dare you criticize Rachel Carson, or how dare you criticize Al Gore. It does start to have a little bit of a religious tone to some of it, that certain leaders should be off limits. And that sort of rubs against our democratic instincts a bit. The argument that we make is that an Inconvenient Truth kept people in a state of fear. And as I was saying before, fear is totally understandable reaction to climate change, and to food shortages, or to the things that we worry about when we worry about global warming. But I also think that if you keep people in a state of fear, they're actually going to become smaller, not larger. Their thinking becomes narrower, not more expansive. They become more resistant to change. They become more reactionary when it comes to thinking about their fellow human beings.
Yeah. And
so that really worried me. And there's another dynamic, which was a bit, just if you're sort of at an archetypal level, there's a way in which that movie is about how there's this big fire-breathing dragon coming to kill you and all the other villagers. Now, here, take this fluorescent light bulb. And it's obviously quite unsatisfying to get to the end of that movie and to have the kind of the picayune solutions presented. Put more air in your tires. I mean, it's kind of like, I think the average viewer quite reasonably says, hey, wait a second, either you've lied about the size of the problem, or you've lied about the solutions. And they're right. The environmental movement hasn't been honest about the solutions. The solutions are not simply these little lifestyle changes, which will do very small amount. It's really about building a whole new energy infrastructure. It's about manufacturing so many solar panels that they're cheaper than natural gas. It's about just sort of a whole kind of recreating the economy. And that's a really different message, I think. And we sometimes hear people say, well, no, but that's so, people want to know what they can do right now. And I think what they're really saying is people want to know what they can do as consumers. And I think that we want to be able to tell people, what can you do as citizens, in addition to consumers, what can you do as citizens to really advance a much more transformative agenda than the one that we got at the end of An Inconvenient Truth?
Do you give him credit? I mean, it seems to me that, Gore has taken a lot of shots from, even Andy Revkin has written somewhat critically about him in the New York Times. There was a piece by Bill Broad, another science writer for the Times, that presented some of the inaccuracies or distortions that were in Gore's movie. I guess what I credit Gore for is just kind of slapping people across the face and raising awareness and getting them to recognize that, hey, this is a really serious problem, which is kind of a precondition for activism. You talk, there's some of these other preconditions that you guys have emphasized, but just raising awareness is so important in this whole area. And then you can then you hope that people will go on to read more about the issue and get into the details of it, and maybe realize that some of Gore's presentation was somewhat simplistic, but still that he served this vital function in sort of getting people to jump out of their seats and take notice.
Yeah, I think the positive effect that Gore has had has really been on the elites, much more than on the public. And so we actually find, when you look at public opinion research on global warming, you don't really find that public concern has basically been steady since the late 1980s. And that always comes as a surprise to people, but just look it up yourself. Gallup just came out with a new poll that found that, concern around global warming is basically the same as it was in 1988. But what Al Gore has done is I think he's gotten global elites, guys like George Soros, the billionaire hedge fund manager, or Richard Branson, the billionaire owner of Virgin Airlines and Virgin Atlantic. He's gotten those guys motivated and mobilized. But what I think the problem is that he hasn't really explained how we can understand the challenge in the context of global economic development, of modernization, of technology innovation. So it all ends up kind of feeding this desperate sense that the most important thing is Kyoto or pollution regulations, where a totally different framework is needed. There's been some new research coming out showing that, global emissions are growing almost twice as fast as the United Nations had estimated they would, largely because China and India and Asia is growing so much faster and using so much more coal than anybody ever imagined. And that you need to really understand. We need to understand that those countries aren't going to slow down their economic growth or their energy consumption because of global warming, and thus this really becomes a technological challenge. And I wish that Al Gore would get back in touch with the Al Gore that helped to bring the internet into commercial use, or the Al Gore who was an early adopter of new technologies, because it's that Al Gore, the high-tech Al Gore, that I think we really need for this next stage of our politics.
Just one more question, Michael. The obligatory softball question to send you on your way. You've got two kids, right?
I do.
How old are they?
9 and 2.
9 and 2. All right, so very young children. Are you sort of deep down? You've got this whole sort of intellectual argument in favor of more optimistic rhetoric, and deep down, how do you feel about the future? How do you feel about the kind of world that your kids will live in when they grow up? Are you genuinely optimistic and hopeful about not just environmental issues, but also weapons of mass destruction and warfare and poverty and overpopulation, all those sorts of things?
Right.
You think we're going to solve this mess we're in?
I do. I think it's a question of how we solve it. I mean, my big concern is that we're going to continue to not take the right action on challenges like global warming, and that humans are just going to burn all the fossil fuels that we have. And so I mean, I'll be honest with you. I when I look at climate change, and even if you look at where the food shortages are happening and where the food riots are happening, and if you look at where agricultural production will go up and where it will go down according to the best estimates, the people who are really going to be affected by this are not like upper middle class kids like my kids in California. It's going to be people in Haiti and in Somalia and in Africa and in probably Southeast Asia, Bangladesh. China might do a little bit better. So I mean, I feel like when I hear other environmentalists get asked about their kids and they kind of go, "Oh, I'm so worried about my kids." I mean, look, you and I and everybody probably watching Blogging Heads TV are some of the richest people in the world. I mean, even if we're not the richest people in the United States, we're the 1 billion out of the 6.7 billion who are the wealthiest, most privileged people on Earth. And the kind of the big tragedy of global warming, or the big inequality of it, is that I think climate change is probably going to affect it's definitely going to affect poor countries and poor people far, far more than it will ever affect me or my kids. And so I really, that's why that's why I ask, when we worry about global warming, what are we worried about? And I have to say I'm much more worried about, poor people in poor countries than I am about my relatively privileged kids.
Thanks, Michael. That's well said. I really enjoyed this, and I look forward to talking to you some more next week at Stevens.
Thanks, John. Again, we're really grateful to get the Green Book Award, and we're looking forward to meeting you in person.
All right. I'll see you soon.
Okay.